Welcome back to part two of this lecture series on Russell Kirk's essay, 10 Conservative Principles. In part one, we looked at principles 1 through 5. Those had to do with Kirk's belief that conservatives believe in an enduring moral order. They believe in custom, convention, and continuity. They believe in the principle of prescription. They believe in the principle of prudence and the principle of variety. So we're picking up where we left off with conservative principle number 6. And Kirk's sixth conservative principle is that conservatives are chastened by their principle of imperfectibility. Some of you are probably familiar with the economist Thomas Sowell. His book, A Conflict of Visions, which was first published in the 1980s, lays out two worldviews or visions that he argued drove much of our social and political conflict. The constrained vision argues that human nature imposes certain limitations on us. These limitations are not just physical, but also ethical, social, and political. By contrast, the unconstrained vision argues that there is no inherent limit to human progress or improvement. Human nature is naturally good, and whatever social problems we have are due to defects in our environment, most of all in the institutions that we have inherited. And if we could just build a better mousetrap by reforming or reshaping our institutions and educating people appropriately, we could eliminate all our problems: crime, war, disease, and all the rest. This division between the two visions goes back to the so-called Enlightenment of the 18th century. The French philosophe Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the first significant thinker to advance the unconstrained vision, which was in clear opposition to the Christian doctrine of humanity's sinful nature. Rousseau attempted to overhaul the entire basis of ethics and social thought, education, and politics. His devotees tried to rebuild society from the ground up during the French Revolution with disastrous consequences. His later disciples confidently predicted the creation of new socialist man through the revamping of human nature through indoctrination. For this and other reasons, Harvard College's Irving Babbitt identified Rousseau as the chief villain of the modern world. He called Rousseau's vision sentimental humanitarianism and opposed to it a more or less classical humanist vision that focused on teaching people to exercise restraint of their appetites. Kirk clearly comes down on the constrained or humanistic side in this debate. He agrees with Alexander Solzhenitsyn that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. Therefore, we can't fix society by dealing with externals. He writes, quote, "To seek for utopia is to end in disaster. The conservative says, we are not made for perfect things. All that we reasonably can expect is a tolerably ordered, just, and free society in which some evils, maladjustments, and suffering will continue to lurk." End quote. Kirk always insisted that this recognition of human imperfectibility does not preclude the possibility of reform. In fact, prudent conservatives should always be on the lookout for areas in which reform is both needed and practicable. But he also agreed with Irving Babbitt that education for self-control is the best approach, and with Thomas Sowell that when it comes to social and political problems, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. So that's conservative principle number 6. Moving on to number 7, conservatives are persuaded that freedom and property are closely linked. So here we come to the one part of the essay where Kirk nods to the discipline of economics. Kirk sparred with economists, even good ones, at various times throughout his career. When he did so, it was normally because he resisted the widely recognized tendency of economic imperialism. I'm not talking about colonies in Africa here. I'm talking about how economists often use their discipline's methodology to attempt to uncover new insights in areas usually considered outside that domain, such as religion or marriage. That can be okay as far as it goes, but economists often can't resist going beyond pure description and end up making recommendations about these areas that ignore all the non-economic realities that influence them. Kirk, of course, was not an economist himself, but for a layman, he was well versed in the field. In fact, in the 1980s, he wrote an economics textbook for high school students that showed his keen understanding of many of the significant elements of the discipline. As an independent man of letters, Kirk always understood economics, like politics, to be of secondary importance next to the weightier fields of moral philosophy, literature, and history. But that did not mean that philosophers and the like could ignore the important lessons of political economy, one of which is that you cannot have a free society in the absence of private property. Private property is essential, writes Kirk, because it enables households to establish and maintain a sphere of independence. Ownership of property also helps to discipline the owner, teaching him responsibility and imposing on him certain duties toward the community. It encourages the adoption of a long-term perspective, with the prospect of passing one's property on to one's heirs. All of these are reasons why Kirk agrees with writers like Henry Maine that private property is an essential underpinning of civilization itself. This is not to say that only the owners of property are the beneficiaries of living in a private property system. That is certainly not the case. Even propertyless people benefit from the increased level of general material prosperity that private property creates. But Kirk did endorse the position, often associated with distributism, that ownership of property should be as widely dispersed as possible. Widespread property ownership spreads its cultural benefits more evenly across the society. He recognized that even in such a system, there would inevitably be some material inequalities, but that this reality should be accepted. We are not given the choice between a prosperous private property system with some inequality and a prosperous communal property system with no economic inequality. Communal property can only work on a very small scale. The individual household, the monastic house, or other religious commune. Attempts to adopt communal property will always be thwarted by the limitations of knowledge and the assertion of human nature. So that's conservative principle number 7 on the importance of private property. Conservative principle number 8. Conservatives uphold voluntary community quite as they oppose involuntary collectivism. Russell Kirk's championing of private property does not mean that he was in favor of rugged individualism or that he was looking for the supermen described in the novels of Ayn Rand. Throughout his career, he was critical of libertarians and the seeming lack of concern for real community in their never-ending advocacy for individual rights. In the 1950s, after the libertarian Frank Chodorov started the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists, ISI, Kirk wrote to the organization to complain that its name was oxymoronic. There is no such thing as a true society of individualists. The group later changed its name to the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. So Kirk understands the good life as one that is lived in community with others. We are not islands unto ourselves. Although he was celebrated in cultural capitals like New York City, he was content because of his family ties to live in the relative backwater of Mecosta, Michigan, a small logging town that was already in decline when he moved there in the mid-1950s to write and to tend aging members of his extended family. Over the following 4 decades, Kirk lived out the sort of life described by Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America. participating in all manner of local associations, along with his wife, Annette. Excuse me. Kirk affirmed the principle of subsidiarity, according to which decisions should be made at the most local level possible. He writes in this essay, quote, "In a genuine community, the decisions most directly affecting the lives of citizens are made locally and voluntarily. Some of these functions are carried out by local political bodies, others by private associations. So long as they are kept local and are marked by the general agreement of those affected, they constitute healthy community. But when these functions pass by default or usurpation to centralized authority, then community is in serious danger," end quote. Throughout his career, Kirk warned against centralized power. The distant manager or bureaucrat usually does not understand or sympathize with the needs and concerns of local people. In the name of efficiency or equality, these functionaries usually seek to impose a one size fits all system onto the people they are tasked with governing or regulating. Such a system is detrimental to local people in at least two ways. First, it tends to disregard their wishes. Second, it deprives them of the opportunity to develop civic virtue through the exercise of duties and responsibilities at the local level. In short, it makes life less human. Again, Kirk was setting himself against fashionable opinion on this question. Throughout his life, civic and academic leaders routinely praised the visions of central planning and bureaucratic management of society. Even near the end of the Cold War, when the human rights abuses of the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries had become widely known, it was easy to find academics and other public figures who continued to argue that state ownership of the means of production and central planning should still be adopted in the Western world. They insisted that it was inherently more efficient than our system of private property, and that there was no necessary connection between full socialism and oppression of ordinary people. The Russians had simply been doing it wrong. Kirk knew better. He wanted to empower what Edmund Burke called society's little platoons of households, neighborhoods, and associations, to give them the ability to provide people insulation from both the ordinary struggles of life and from the state. So subsidiarity, voluntary community, is conservative principle number 8. Principle number 9, the conservative perceives the need for prudent restraints upon power and upon human passions. This is a principle that can be taken in several different directions. One obvious direction is the insights of Montesquieu, the 18th century French thinker who inspired much of the deliberation of America's founding fathers at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. These insights include some of the things we all presumably learned about in civics class back in high school, things like the separation of powers and checks and balances in the political system. Although Montesquieu provided the framing of these questions for the founding generation, he was drawing on a much older tradition, dating back at least to Aristotle, that a mixed government made up of competing interests and classes was the one most likely to safeguard tolerable levels of justice and liberty in society. Kirk understood Lord Acton's maxim that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He endorsed the founding fathers' incorporation of these principles into the American system as part of a recognition of the inherent weakness in human nature. Power has to be restrained and balanced, or imperfect men will abuse it when it is given to them. In 10 Conservative Principles, Kirk also refers to, quote, the old intricate web of restraints upon will and appetite, end quote, in addition to the principles that we all learned about in civics class. What does that phrase mean? I think it's fair to refer back to Irving Babbitt again here and the humanistic stress on restraint in the educational curriculum, religious teachings about concupiscence, most obviously in the Christian tradition, but also in the traditions of the world's other great religions and philosophical systems. The incentives created by traditional notions of public honor and shame, the rules of conduct that associations use to govern themselves and their members. These are all things the conservative applauds, Kirk says. I think it's worth pointing out here that the proponents of the unconstrained vision tend to dislike all these things. Much of the rhetoric coming from the followers of Rousseau decries these constraints on behavior on the grounds that they prevent people from being their authentic selves. Remember their contention that human nature is naturally good and that our problems are the result of external and artificial constraints that prevent that goodness from manifesting itself. Repressing our natural inclinations leads to neuroses, Sigmund Freud says. We are our desires, the postmodern thinks. They are our identity, and reining in those desires is detrimental to our mental health. Telling people their desires are wrong is tantamount to denying their right to exist. Once again, Kirk knows better. Even Freud understood that unleashing the id would be the end of civilization. One of Kirk's constant refrains is that order in the commonwealth flows from order in the individual soul. Only people who lead well-ordered and well-regulated lives can put together a well-ordered society. One of the most important lessons that Kirkian conservatism can help us learn today is that we need to learn how to tell ourselves no when our appetites threaten to drive us beyond the limits of prudence and reason. So we're coming down to our final conservative principle, number 10. The thinking conservative understands that permanence and change must be recognized and reconciled in a vigorous society. But when I was in graduate school, I specialized in the 16th and 17th centuries. I took classes on the Italian Renaissance, the Reformation era, Tudor England, Stuart England, and so on. And I was required to become familiar with the leading scholarly journals in each of those subfields. I must have read dozens of articles with titles like Continuity and Change in 15th Century Florence or Continuity and Change in Elizabethan England. Professional historians, at least when I was in school, were sensitized to this issue of understanding that even in times of significant changes, the day-to-day lives of ordinary people often remained relatively untouched for long periods of time, at least in the pre-modern era. Russell Kirk was very familiar with this theme, and as we've already noted, his conservatism is not interested in encasing society in amber so that nothing ever changes. But from the time he came onto the public scene in the 1950s, he was concerned that the proper relationship between these two principles, what he calls permanence and progression in this essay, had been severely disrupted. In The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Conservatism, originally published in 1957, but which is now in print under the title Russell Kirk's Concise Guide to Conservatism, Kirk makes a statement that I first read 20 years ago and that has stuck with me ever since. He acknowledges that there have been certain places and times in which too much emphasis has been placed on tradition and continuity, and that society was not given the proper opportunity to change and adapt. He then goes on to say that that is not the world we're living in today. All the weight is on the other side, toward the idea of progress and change. And he said that in 1957. What would he think about the world today? The situation that sociologist Zygmunt Bauman calls liquid modernity, in which change is so rapid that people can't even adjust to new realities before they change again. I think Kirk would say that our society seems to have forgotten that stability and continuity are good things, and that when we don't have them in sufficient measure, we suffer in significant ways. Let me offer just one example from our own historical moment. the decline in marriage and childbearing in our society over the past 15 years or thereabouts. These are complex phenomena with various causes. And if you'd like to know more about them, I can unhesitatingly recommend two books, Brad Wilcox's Get Married and Tim Carney's Family Unfriendly. But the survey data is pretty clear in showing that a lot of people who would like to be married are not, and that people in general would like to have more children than they actually do. One of the most commonly offered reasons for why people aren't getting married and having children at the rates they say they want to is uncertainty about the future. Economic anxiety and fear of divorce are big components of this uncertainty. Our society has not done these young people any favors by undermining supports for social and economic stability in the past couple of generations, adopting policies like no-fault divorce, and nudging more and more people into the so-called gig economy. Kirk points to the problem this way in the essay, quote, "Change is essential to the body social. But if that body is to be vigorous, the change must occur in a regular manner, harmonizing with the form and nature of that body. Otherwise, change produces a monstrous growth, a cancer which devours its host." End quote. Has our pace of social change over the past several generations harmonized with the form and nature of our social and political body? I think there's a good case to be made that it has not, and that we need to emphasize once again the value of permanence in public discourse. So these are Russell Kirk's 10 conservative principles. Maybe they resonate with you, but you're still frustrated that they don't contain much in the way of specific policy recommendations. I think that if that's your frustration, Kirk might caution you against seeking a shortcut to those sorts of conclusions before adjusting your orientation to the permanent things. So it's helpful to take a step back and look at the big picture of these permanent things that Kirk writes about and that are lacking to a great extent in our society today. And once we get a handle on those, maybe we can come up with better policy ideas that fit our current circumstances. Thank you for your attention. I hope you found these two lectures on Russell Kirk's 10 Conservative Principles informative and helpful. And please go read the essay and read other works by Russell Kirk, and also continue to take advantage of the materials that are available from the Russell Kirk Center School of Conservative Studies. Thanks for watching.